Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds, featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I am your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations and to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Maybe you've been listening for a while, or this is your first episode. If you like what you hear, would you do us a favor by rating and reviewing us on iTunes? This is a fantastic way to tell us you enjoy what we are creating. Also, if you want more MTSS resources, sign up for our weekly newsletter using the link in our show notes, and check out our website for all the blogs and guides you would ever need about MTSS. So we're going to be diving into a topic that sits at the heart of supporting all learners, understanding how MTSS and special education work together as a unified system. And we're honored to have two exceptional leaders guiding this conversation. Karen Hamilton, who is a retired assistant superintendent and education consultant, who brings 40 years of dedication to supporting students and shaping systems that work for every child. And joining her is Hiral Vekaria, who is the director of the leadership development at the National Association of School Psychologists, whose expertise is in leadership and systemic practices that helps educators nationwide. So together, Karen and Hiral will explore why MTSS and special education are not separate systems, but interwoven layers of support. And they'll share some actionable takeaways. And so I'm so excited to have them here today. So we all know that change isn't easy, but as you'll hear, a multi-tiered system of support is simply just good for kids.
Well, we're excited to be here today. I thought it'd be helpful just to give a context of how Hiral and I came to know each other and work together since we don't now. I was the assistant superintendent for special ed in a large school district, and we were launching on how do we do MTSS in a very, very large school system, and looking at how we do that systemically. We were looking to get some support in that area. And Hiral, I believe that a colleague met you at a conference and brought you back.
Yes, I met a colleague at White County at a National Association of School Psychologists conference. And I was transitioning to North Carolina and was looking for a job as a school psychologist. And she said, I've got something for you. In my previous roles before that, I was the MTSS implementation consultant for 12 elementary schools. And I had been working on systems change pretty much through grad school. So when the role was described to me, I thought, well, this could be the dream, right? Working at the systems level at a county, like a district level. So enter me to Wake County Public Schools, and that's where I met Karen.
And it's been a lot of fun for all that time and since then. So let's jump in.
Okay. So no matter where we work in a school building at the district level, we already work in a system that's supporting kids. And it's important to recognize that the way we design our support practices, that's how you get the outcomes, right? So we wanted to really emphasize and talk about buy-in when we talk about systems change, whether it's at the district level, whether it's at the school-based level, or just general buy-in from your staff when you look at this concept of MTSS. We know that leadership needs to recognize and understand the value of the systems that we function in, but also recognize that systems change and adapt over time, because we know that we already exist in those systems, and we know that there are tweaks that we need to make to them consistently in evaluating them. And it is the right thing for kids to create systems that promote outcomes that are best for all kids.
So Hiral, when we started working together, you walked into a system that already had some structure and some cultural preconceptions about how we work with kids. What would you say was the biggest thing you saw that we needed to shift?
I think the biggest thing we needed to talk about was the belief that all students can access core instructional practices and that they can learn from that. I think that's something that's rampant across our education systems, where we want to silo children, you know, based on disability category or giftedness or what have you. So it's a spectrum. But what I think at the you know, the crux of any system, especially a school system, is the fact that core instruction should be accessible to any child. That was kind of the biggest conversation we needed to continue to have for our administrators and for our leadership to understand that access was extremely important for outcomes.
So that's a great segue. And I'm going to reiterate those. And I think it's important to just focus on this idea that when we talk about all students, we are seriously talking about all students. MTSS is the way we do business, and it provides this strong educational foundation for all students in the presence of really good instruction and data-based interventions. You're going to hear me say that a couple of times, and we just heard Hiral say that. This includes students with disabilities who, just as a reminder, are first part of the general education population. So when your district gets money, when your district is thinking about educational opportunities, all of that comes to every student. And you get funding and you get materials for students with disabilities before the additional special education opportunities and funding and materials are added. So again, it just reiterates this structure of all students means all students. This temptation to look at your kiddos as general ed and special ed and keep those systems separate is just going to hinder this process. The best way to think about your students is they're all general ed first, and they have all access and entitlements to this solid basic educational foundation, and they all have different strengths and needs. And within that framework, some of those students with disabilities will need a more prescribed experience, and their needs will be addressed with an IEP and with specially designed instruction. But always the first emphasis is on the general core instruction in the presence of intervention. The intent of the original special ed law, which I'm old enough to have been around for and implemented some of the first IEPs, the intent of Public Law 94-142, or the Education of All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, was to ensure that students with disabilities have the same access to educational opportunities as their non-disabled peers. And that led to the, I'm sure you understand, the complex set of federal and state regulations that guide the identification and service provision for students with disabilities. And within that implementation came the development of IEPs and specially designed instruction. And I know that you know the identification and service provision for students with disabilities, no matter how we're implementing MTSS, is just non-negotiable, and a failure to do so would put a district or a principal or a teacher at risk. Again, once we're looking at that narrow foundation, we are always doing it in the context of that larger general core. Having said that, a good framework for MTSS allows for and provides a system of instruction for all children, including students with disabilities, and that tiered framework that includes instructional delivery and interventions. For all students, most of that instruction and most of those interventions occur in a general classroom. And for students with disabilities, as you know, some specially designed instruction occurs outside of the general education classroom with a special education teacher. The first question is always, what is the basic sound core instruction that meets the needs of students with disabilities with accommodations and modifications in the general content classroom? Prior to identification, and while a student is receiving intervention, and then after identification, we still have to parse out what instruction remains part of the general core and can occur with the general education teacher, and what specifically specially designed instruction should be provided by a certified special education teacher. So this parsing causes districts to envision what supports are needed for teachers and students in the general education classroom and what remains part of the special education.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue, Karen, to talking a little bit about what does that look like and feel like And I think a lot of times, you know, systems that have time, like schedules is a big thing that we talk about, right? And I think one of the things to talk about is when you're looking at providing this continuum of support, all of that again starts with your core instructional practices and how all students access intervention, because it's likely that there are students that need intervention and some students that need enrichment as well. So when you think about a system of supports, how are you providing that in an equitable manner for all children? Because some level of differentiation is needed to support for any child, right? I think the other thing is we need to also think through, do we have a system of interventions in place that address kind of the key foundational areas of learning that all children can access? And this would be students in general education and special education. And implementation of that certainly has its hurdles and barriers that we're not going to go into today, but we recognize this aspect of resource mapping and looking through what you have to support that, what we call like a standard treatment protocol that's effective practices for all kids. And this is what's going to get you the outcomes that your system is designed to get.
So I think branching from that, I think this whole idea of a standard treatment protocol and a system of interventions can be daunting if that's not something that you've been doing. Can you speak a little bit about what resources teachers and schools can take a look at that exist within their buildings and how to start organizing those?
Yeah, one of the things that I actually worked with in schools doing this was we resource mapped out every single thing that we had in our building, including any previous intervention practices or what our curriculums were at that time. But most importantly was figuring out our schedule. And I know that sounds like a silly thing, but sitting together with grade level teams, our specials teachers and our special education teachers to map out the schedule was the biggest piece of the puzzle when we determined how interventions would be conducted across the grade level. What that allowed us to do was to shift when students needed extra support. We had space in the schedule to do that. We also utilized every single body that we had in our building, because this becomes an issue with resource allocations and the number of reading specialists or the number of paraprofessionals. And again, what it started with was this firm belief that we protected our core instruction for all grade levels. So core instruction was a non-negotiable for every single child. And then we mapped out what that support would look like at a grade level, at a school level, but also at the class level. So we were able to utilize every part of our building. We even had volunteers come in to do enrichment activities, right? So it's your community. It's what you tap into to build the system that you envision. But that vision truly comes from determining what your non-negotiables are, which in this case was good quality access to core and the ability to shift between tiers for all students. So it wasn't specific to an IEP. It wasn't specific to, it was really just about the data and what did that look like for kids. More to come on that on later on.
So when you and I worked together, and I know when you went to Maryland, like this sounds good when we're thinking about it. And it sounded good when we started putting practices to place down on paper. But talk about buy-in. How hard was that shift, and what did we do in our district, and what did you do later in Maryland that helped teachers and school administration see that this might be worthwhile?
Yeah, that's a great question. For buy-in, you really have to know your audience, right? So when you're talking to a superintendent's leadership team, your buy-in conversations are going to be very different than when you have a conversation with your school-based team. When we talked to our superintendent leadership team, we shared data for longitudinal data over 5 to 7 years about the predictive validity for students in terms of their reading scores, right? And then we talked about how in order for us, if we know that this one point in their first grade career has predictive validity in terms of how they will be reading for the rest of their lives, then we talked about, well, we have these strong evidence-based interventions that support large systems of students, and here's how we can do that. So we mapped out the vision, because that's what you do with like a larger system team, but it's different at the school level. At the school level, you have to address your target population, the resources that you have, and the general buy-in truly is less about what MTSS is, but it's about how the system is going to impact that teacher or that grade level in their day-to-day functioning. So it was really talking about, you're already doing all of these practices. Let's make it strategic. Let's make it evaluative in how we're looking at student data. And again, I think the foundation of some of that was having those well-researched practices in place, and how that training would occur and how we would support the individuals delivering those interventions on top of the core instruction. So it had to be well thought out for our audience, but there was a very different approach to buy-in. Sometimes it was conversations at staff meetings, sometimes it was conversations at the holiday party, or sometimes it was really, you know, those students that are English language learners and you wanted to do a vocabulary intervention for them, this is how we'll do it. So again, buy-in looks different, but again, the foundation always came back to good practices for students.
So we really carried this thing uphill. When we started talking with the superintendent's leadership team, we worked hard. I was the assistant superintendent for special ed, but we worked hard not to make this a special ed initiative, to make sure, but also to make sure that students with disabilities were included in this all. Like, what were some indicators that we were starting to get a cultural shift, one at the superintendent's leadership team level, and then when we started working, we worked departmentally to kind of foster that along? What were some things that you felt like were indicators that we were starting to get the shift?
I think one of the things was just a shift in the conversation about separating that special ed versus general ed piece. The conversations became more about how to sustain a system for all students and how do we train all teachers. So it wasn't about, we're going to run this training, offer a professional learning opportunity for, general education teachers. It was more about, bring your school team, include your special ed teachers, your school psychologists, your other service professionals. So the conversation shifted from this siloed approach to, well, that's a SPED thing, or, that's a SPED program that they need to buy. It was more about, well, if this is what works for all kids, how do we make that happen? That was one shift. But I think the other shift also was like walking the walk. When we say that we want good outcomes for all of our children, it's also acknowledging the inequities that existed, right? That was the first thing. It was actually folks saying, wow, there are inequities in how core instruction reaches our students, which then leads to disproportionality in special education. That was the biggest connection I think that we made, which helped our leadership team understand that in order to decrease disproportionality, increase access for all children, this was the right system to do that. Those were very hard conversations that I would say took a very long time, but were very important. I think, Karen, and I think you supported a lot of that, navigating those nuances, but it ultimately was about equitable access.
So one of the bumps in the road that we ran into is this convoluted conversation about, we want to identify a student to evaluate a student to determine if they have a disability. How do the interventions around that evaluation process and the interventions that are already existing in the school kind of come together?
Yeah, and I think that's a question that a lot of school psychologists and teams sit with, especially when, there's a push for an evaluation, or if there is, just that the student is truly struggling. Around that, we really talked about the fact that you can provide interventions concurrent to doing an evaluation, right? I think that what we focused on was the fact that providing the support was the highest priority. Gathering those data and looking at that over time was also priority, but we never wanted a child to wait to have an eligibility criteria or to meet a certain disability category to receive the intervention that we needed. So we talked a lot about doing that support concurrently while also meeting our federal obligation of conducting that evaluation, and then making that determination with like your whole school team.
And I think one of the things that we found as we got better at implementation is that schools began to see that this system of instruction with intervention, the interventions naturally occurred when they needed to occur and with the intensity that they did. And helping schools understand that we don't put those interventions in a box and then start new interventions with our referral process, I think really helped us jump over a hurdle with teachers and school administrations going, yeah, we're kind of already doing this work.
Right. And I think the conversations at the school level shifted to, well, thank you, parent, for being here. Let's tell you a little bit about what we've been doing and what our options are. I think for schools to have the opportunity to say, we've got a menu of items for each category of reading or math, and here's how we're going to support your child, allowed the school to implement those things with fidelity. But I think it was also helping helping folks understand that on top of core instruction, they also get X, Y, and Z. So it's not instead of, it's on top of that. Those were, I think, the big shifts that we saw once we started to implement our conversations around standard treatment protocol. And it was kind of a relief for some teachers where it was, oh, you're giving me what works. And I think that was big for our system too.
I also think that you're touching on the reduction in disproportionality is critical to this conversation. I think most districts find that they're disproportionate, not just in over-identification of special education, but in racial categories as well. And when we're focused on core instruction in the presence of intervention, I think that we found that we were seeing improvements in schools that were working hard to look at not just their culture, but fidelity to implementation. I'm wondering, as we get through that, I've also got your notes in front of me. What are some of the key things that you think folks should leave with today?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things we wanted you all to leave with today is that MTSS as a system is for all students. And we want to work really hard in breaking down those silos related to general education and special education, because it is truly what is best for kids. We know that this work is very, very difficult, but we know that it's also doable. If we want to provide equitable access and equitable outcomes for all children, and all meaning all, then we need to function in a system that allows that. That is one of, something that we really want you to take away from our conversation here, knowing that implementation and collaboration are kind of at the crux of doing this work. But truly what it comes down to is, and we asked this question, Karen, I don't know if you remember this, but we always, in the back of my head, I always ask the question, do you truly believe that all children can learn with this core instruction? And I will tell you that there are times that folks will hesitate to answer that question. So addressing the belief, your underlying belief, is okay. And that's a big takeaway for us, because all doesn't mean just the students that do well in a certain type of instructional model. It means every single child that's sitting at the table and every single child at the school. Those would be my big kind of takeaways. What about something from your perspective at the district level, Karen?
So not just I think at the district level and at the school level, I think one of the hardest things for districts and schools to move past is parsing out special education and regular education. And we saw that, of course, with the superintendent's leadership team. We presented data to them that they didn't believe. So as schools and districts move into this, it is really just hanging in there with those difficult conversations that reflect, as you say, people's most personal beliefs about children learning, but also what do they envision as a future for their school and for their district? If we really look to all children means all children, then that becomes your work. That becomes the lens that you actually focus your executable actions on. It's how you make decisions. And when you come to support teachers and when you come to support all of your instructional staff, how does that become a collaborative conversation where we have these needs and we have these resources, and how do we rethink our resources to support our beliefs for what students need. And I think that's challenging. I think that requires a lot of just hanging in there when we're providing leadership for that. And I think it provides, it just requires a lot of steady work and growth as you're doing it.
I agree. I think a great example to add to that is a district that I used to work in where the teacher and faculty, the teacher and staff population was predominantly Caucasian, and our student population was changing over time. The piece of data that convinced our assistant superintendent that MTSS was the right thing was kids for all kids of this tiered, support model was when we looked at data for how African-American boys were accessing core instruction. It was the hardest conversation that I believe that he had sat in. And I remember him saying, I can't believe that this is true. And I think that's a recognition and realization for many administrators, because nobody wants to believe that we're not reaching our students. But the data doesn't lie, right? Said every school psychologist ever. But it was that propelled this conversation of, well, what are we going to do about it, right? And that is where this system of MTSS took a hold, and we looked at what do we have? How do we support all students? And slowly over time, we started to talk about why we have disproportionate outcomes. A very crucial conversation, I believe. And it moved, that district still continues to implement many aspects of MTSS through those crucial conversations and recognition of these data like 10 years ago. So that's kind of our, spiel on MTSS and special ed. Anything else you want to add to that, Karen?
I just want to touch on what you just said, how sustainable it is. Once you shift your thinking, align your resources, and align your practices as well, that system becomes your system. And it can't be discarded like a new curriculum or another implementation factor. Once you start looking at all children, looking at your data and looking at your systems and structures, you can't go back. You can't unlook at it. So I think it's important that when we move this conversation and other conversations for schools and administrators, it's just helping them realize how critical that thinking is.
I think that's so true, because when you work in a school setting, a good example of that was one of our paraprofessionals came over to me and said, well, I think I'm going to tell this teacher that we really got to try the tier 2 intervention before we have any more conversations. And that was a moment that we realized that, wow, we really embedded this into the culture of our school, that anybody that works with kids knows that we're taking all of these steps to do that. But that's important as an administrator or as a leader of a school or a district to remember not to leave out those folks that run those before school and after school programs when they're reading things to them, or when they're helping them decode words, or when they're going into the classroom as classroom helpers. That is what sustains a system. When you include everybody, our physical education teacher would have conversations with us about data. That is when you know that you've made progress in improving the sustainability of a system, and that system is going to shift all the time, and that is okay.
So I think to wrap it up, it's important for district leaders and school leaders to take a hard look at their data. I think it's important for folks to take a hard look at the cultural practices of their districts and their schools, and to be willing to dive into all children mean all children. So I think, Larissa, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you so much for being here. Thanks for listening to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcasts on iTunes? This helps others find our podcasts and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Branching Minds.